What devious practice could cause paranoia, terror, and uncertainty to plague the ancient lands of China? What hidden art was so volatile that it ignited brutal imperial crackdowns on heterodox groups, causing a widespread national panic that forced the state to forbid it under the penalty of the empire's most horrific execution codes? To find the answer, we must travel deep into the subtropical wilderness of southern China. It is the 5th day of the 5th lunar month, the absolute peak of the summer heat. Through the sweltering mist-choked foliage, a lone figure creeps in total secrecy. His eyes are firmly fixed on a scorpion, a notoriously lethal and poisonous predator. With careful calculation, he traps the creature and quickly bundles it into a container. The man is a Wu, a localized spirits medium or sorcerer. For days, he has been stalking the swarming swampy valleys, harvesting the deadliest crawling predators the land has to offer: vipers, centipedes, and toxic toads. These are the living ingredients for the most feared occult weapon in Chinese history: the cultivation of the gu, a spiritual and biological toxin of such legendary venomous potency that its mere existence threatened the stability of the imperial throne itself. For centuries, Chinese records have documented this brutal claustrophobic ritual of forced cannibalism. The Wu would place these poisonous insects into a clay vessel or jar and securely cover the opening. In the dark, confined ceramic prison, nature's deadliest invertebrates would be forced into a frantic life or death battle royale, waging a silent war of survival as they devoured each other, until only one remained. It was believed that this lone survivor did not merely win a fight, it physically and spiritually absorbed the compressed and combined lethal potencies of all its defeated combatants into its own flesh. This survivor was a gu, a living, demonic familiar. The grim, visual gravity of this practice is permanently etched into the ancient Chinese language itself. The written character for the gu is a literal pictogram of crawling insects locked tight inside a wide food basin. This dark art was treated as such a severe threat to national security that as early as the Zhou dynasty, the imperial government established a specialized, state-funded anti-sorcery task force. These elite officials were legally commissioned to hunt down these hidden goo pots, weaponizing their own specialized counterspells and toxic herbs to exterminate the practitioners. The state's defense mechanisms were brutal. Imperial records from the year 675 BC reveal that when summer hits its sweltering peak and the threat of goo magic was at its highest, the ruler of the Qin state ordered a gruesome public defense. Slaughtered dogs were butchered and nailed directly to the four massive gates of the capital city. To the ancient mind, this was not mindless cruelty. It was a deployment of a highly calculated spiritual defense, using the aggressive yang energy of the animal to violently repulse any invisible wave of insect sorcery trying to breach the city walls. While the state feared the gu, as a tool of political sabotage. On the ground, the magic was used for far more intimate, terrifying purposes. Historically, once a creature emerged victorious from a ceramic prison, it was no longer considered a mortal insect. It transformed into an invisible, highly intelligent demonic servant at will, and its presence completely altered the laws of nature inside the breeder's home. The most notorious subtype of this magic was a jinchan, or golden silkworm. To the outside world, a household harbouring this spirit was instantly recognisable by a deeply unsettling trait. The home was impossibly and unnaturally spotless. Folklore held that the invisible silkworm spirit acted as an obsessive domestic servant, constantly sweeping the floors and polishing the walls to an eerie shine. But this meticulous cleanliness masked a horrific, predatory greed. The breeder had to feed the entity expensive Sichuan silk and gold dust, and in return, the spirit would siphon away the wealth of their neighbours. If slipped into a victim's food, the jinchan's waste matter acted as a hyper-lethal, slow-acting toxin. It would cause a grueling wasting disease, causing the victim's internal organs to decay as their family fortune mysteriously vanished, only to rematerialise inside the breeder's pristine cupboards. If a breeder tried to hoard his stolen wealth, the jinchan would turn its insatiable hunger onto the master's own lineage. To escape this doom, owners had to perform a desperate ritual known as marrying off the silkworm. Wrapping gold coins and the invisible spirit inside a beautiful basket and abandoning it at a public crossroads, hoping an unsuspecting traveller will pick it up and inherit the death sentence. But if a victim was targeted by this curse, diagnosing it was an absolute psychological nightmare. Ancient medical texts warn that the goose spirit was completely sentient and held total dominion over the host's mind. When an anxious doctor or an investigator sat by the patient's bedside and asked directly if their agony was a work of witchcraft, the invisible entity would execute a psychological hijack. Seizing control of the victim's own vocal cords, the demon would force them to deny that their illness was a work of a goo, effectively silencing the host to protect itself from discovery. The ultimate horror, however, occurred at the moment of death. The 8th century pharmacologist Zhang Shangqi recorded that once the invisible parasite had completely devoured the victim's internal organs and the body failed, the spirit will physically manifest. The grotesque, venomous creature would literally crawl out from the natural apertures of the corpse, escaping through the deceased victim's mouth or anus. In these grim moments, an extraordinary opportunity arose for the desperate. If a bystander was exceptionally brave, they could lie in wait beside the fresh corpse, wait for the emerging monster, and trap it in a clean container. By catching and drying the fleeing entity in the sun, they could intercept the spiritual contract, conquering the demonic familiar for themselves to amass their own illicit fortune. For women living in the rigid, patriarchal structures of the subtropical South, a variation of the snake vessel poison became a dark, chemical leash known as a love filter. If a woman feared her partner would abandon her, she would lace his food with a dormant microscopic dose of the goo. It acted as a biological countdown. If the man stayed loyal and returned to her house before the deadline, she would secretly feed him the antidote, keeping him healthy. But if he cheated or tried to leave the village, the poison would activate, forcing compliance through the absolute terror of physical agony. To cultivate these terrifying weapons, a practitioner relied on the voodoo, the 5 poisonous animals. In the classical ancient textbooks of northern China, the mandatory lineup was locked in place. The viper, the scorpion, the centipede, the toad, and the gecko. But as the magic drifted into the deeper, denser jungles of the south, local practitioners noticed a massive flaw in the ancient formula. Geckos are completely harmless, lacking any venom or stings. To fix this cosmic and biological imbalance, regional folklore shifted, replacing the lizard with the spider. This shifting lineup created an aggressive, terrifying lexicon of fear. Yet, despite their inherently malevolent nature, the common people practiced a profound philosophy called Idu Gudu, fighting poison with poison. Mothers would lovingly stitch images of these exact 5 creatures onto their children's clothing or stamp them onto heavy brass coins. They believed that the concentrated, terrifying toxicity of the 5 poisons would create an aggressive spiritual firewall, scaring away any wandering plague demons or malevolent spirits trying to make the child sick. Because the threat of an intelligent targeted attack was an everyday reality, ancient Chinese medicine evolved a highly specialized forensic defense system to neutralize the venom. 12th century medical logs record that when a victim was hit by a goo curse, it would trigger an agonizing wasting disease, causing the victim to vomit and pass a horrific bloody liquid resembling rotten meat as their internal organs were slowly digested from within. To break the hold of the goo, doctors would blend raw leek juice with high-proof spirits, causing the patient to violently vomit up the active, serpentine organisms. To catch the infection, doctors utilized a series of covert, forensic tests pioneered in the 4th century by the Taoist alchemist Gu Hong. First, they would force the victim to spit into a bowl of pure water. If the spittle immediately sank to the bottom, the goo infection was confirmed. Next, they would place a hard, dry pea underneath the patient's tongue. If the pea unnaturally swelled and shed its skin within minutes, it proved a parasite was feeding inside the mouth. In highly advanced stages of the infection, a bizarre physical symptom emerged. A static, unnatural glare would materialize around the patient's head, and if an investigator touched their scalp, the friction would emit a crackling, visible electrical spark into the air. To bypass the silencing power of the demon, the doctor had to act like a spy. In total secrecy, without informing the dying patient, they would sneak a fresh, highly aromatic Myoga ginger root directly underneath their sleeping mat. Alternatively, they would burn the leather skin of a sacred justice drum into an ash potion. The intense spiritual resonance will cause the internal organisms to violently choke, shattering their mental hold and forcing the patient to suddenly wake up screaming, revealing the exact identity of the sorcerer who sent the curse. 4th Sanctuary chronicles record that this predatory warfare could be triggered through pure spiritual intent. A holy ascetic Buddhist monk named Tarn knowingly walked into the home of a notorious gu breeding family. It was a household where no outsider had ever accepted a drink without vomiting blood and dying. When the master of the house placed a cursed plate of food before the monk, Tarn Yu simply closed his eyes and began chanting his sacred vows. The spiritual friction was instantaneous. Caught in the invisible crossfire of his spells, the illusion collapsed. A pair of live centipedes, over a foot in length, suddenly jumped directly out of his food and fled frantically across the floor. The monk calmly ate his fill and walked away, entirely untouched by the venom. But the spectres let loose by these sorcerers did not always attack in covert internal ways. Sung Dynasty records preserved a chilling account of a young scholar named Jui Ren who served as a private secretary in the southern province of Guangxi. During a sweltering summer feast, the guests took off their hats to escape the heat, only to look over and see a giant grotesque frog squatting directly on top of the scholar's head. They violently knocked the beast off, and the moment it hit the floor, it vanished into thin air. Yet hours later, at midnight, the invisible entity crawled back onto his head. When they struck it a second time, it crashed into the banquet table, shattering it to pieces, before dissolving into the shadows. The true nightmare began when the scholar retired to his bedchambers. An agonizing ulcer bubbled up on his head. Within 24 hours, all the hair on his crown had fell out in clumps, and a massive red-skinned tumour had erupted from his scalp. Suddenly, the swelling split open, and a living frog peeped out of his flesh, its forelegs resting on the crown of his head, while its lower body remained rooted deep inside his skin. Doctors attempted to prick it with iron needles and pull it out, but the creature's spiritual grip was so tight that the manipulation caused the scholar intolerable agony. It was then that an old gatekeeper intervened. Invoking the ancient laws of sympathetic magic, he revealed that the creature was a goo frog, and it could only be broken by its cosmic opposite, pure gold, the ultimate element of solar yang energy. The moment they pierced the entity with a golden hairpin, the spell short-circuited. The frog died instantly and was extracted from the flesh. The scholar survived, but for the rest of his days, a permanent sunken crater remained etched into his skull bone, a lifelong physical scar of his encounter with the occult. If a physician could successfully identify exactly which creature had won the gladiator war inside the sorcerer's jar, they could weaponize a strict, circular hierarchy of nature, a spiritual game of rock, paper, scissors. The 8th century pharmacologist Sheng Changqi recorded that the elements used to create the goo were the exact keys required to destroy it. To annihilate a snake goo, the doctor prescribed centipede powder. To crush a centipede goo, they deployed the fluid of a frog. And to dissolve a frog goo, they turned back to the venom of the snake. Because these creatures occupied a ruthless predatory loop in the physical jungle, their compressed astral energies would carry the same predatory dominance into the patient's stomach, naturally hunting down and subduing their cosmic rivals from within. For families living in constant terror of these targeted imbalances, prevention began in the cradle. Medieval Ming Dynasty medical manuals prescribed an extraordinary vaccine, feeding young children the flesh of spotted and striped cats from an early age. Because cats effortlessly hunt down snakes and toads and scorpions, digesting feline meat was believed to permanently alter the child's spiritual anatomy. If a witch tried to poison them years later, the dormant cat energy living in their bloodstream would instantly wake up and tear the curse apart. It was a radical application of sympathetic medicine, using everything from a cat's meat to the pulverized bones of a cat's skull to fight off the very same cat spectres that had haunted the empire since the Sui dynasty. The natural environment itself acted as a biological radar system. Communities noted that domestic fowls and cocks possessed an extreme sensitivity to dark magic. If a flock of chickens suddenly fled a courtyard for no apparent reason, or refused to come down from the high trees during the daylight hours, it served as an immediate emergency alarm to the village that the women of that household were secretly harbouring a cannibal bug jar in the dark. But when a curse was too deep for animal remedies, doctors turned to the absolute explosive wrath of heaven itself. In the southernmost tip of the empire, Leje, the peninsula of thunder, is a land dense with lightning strikes. There, the farmers frequently dug up mysterious, beautifully polished stone axes and knives buried deep within the scorched earth. The common people believed these thunderbolt stones were literal weapons dropped from the sky by the god of thunder to split open demons. Packed with pure explosive celestial energy, these artifacts were ground into a fine powder and fed to the dying. It is a profound historical irony. What the ancient Chinese revered as divine alchemical cures dropped from the heavens was actually something far older. The long forgotten, beautifully preserved tools of a prehistoric Stone Age, weaponized by the Imperial doctors to fight an invisible war of the mind. As we have seen, this wealth-stealing sorcery was completely unkillable. It was immune to fire, water, and iron blades, and because the breeders could only escape the demon's greed by marrying it off at a public crossroads, the streets of ancient China were stalked by a quiet, lingering terror. But history records that not all men succumbed to the fear. In the ancient province of Anhui, a brilliant but impoverished scholar named Zhang Long opened his door in the cool morning hours and found one of these abandoned bamboo baskets sitting outside his gate. Packed inside was over 100 ounces of silver wine cups. Believing it was a gift from heaven, he brought it inside, only to feel a golden, glittering caterpillar crawling up his thigh. Terrified, Long plucked it off, but it instantly reappeared. He crushed it under his heel, but the unkillable creature materialized again on his breast and then on his belly. It was in his food, in his drink, and on his blankets. A wise friend gave him a grim diagnosis. He had unintentionally adopted a goo. If he used the caterpillar to poison his neighbours, it would make him fabulously rich. But if he refused, it would crawl inside of his belly and eat his intestines. Upon hearing this, Long looked up to heaven, sighed, and made an extraordinary choice. In all of my life, I have cultivated purity of conduct. I will never lose my purity. Refusing to murder his fellow man for gold, Long calmly took the golden caterpillar, threw it into his mouth, and swallowed the living demon whole. His crying family waited for him to drop dead in agony. But days passed, and then months, and nothing happened. The sheer, unyielding moral integrity of his character acted like acid, completely dissolving the unkillable curse inside of his stomach, and Long lived to a ripe old age. For those who chose the path of darkness, however, justice was unforgiving. The fear of the bug jar was so absolute that travellers moving through the south refused to touch a cup of wine unless their host took a sip first to prove it wasn't poisoned. If a traveller arrived at a remote rural inn and suspected foul play, they would deploy a high-stakes psychological bluff, walking up behind the innkeeper, tapping them firmly on the shoulder and demanding to know if they harboured a goo inside the house. By shattering the veil of secrecy, the sorcerer was instantly disarmed, knowing their magical frequencies had been exposed. If the gold caterpillar managed to firmly latch onto a family, its dark contract left a grotesque physical imprint. 17th century documents notes that while the master amassed massive riches, their physical body paid the price. The breeder's face would slowly turn a sickening, brilliant metallic gold colour. Their abdomen would violently inflate with dropsy, and they would drop dead within 5 years, passing the ancestral curse down to slaughter their sons. To hunt down the entity before this doom arrived, Imperial investigators would loose a pair of live hedgehogs into the estate. Blinded by fear of the hedgehog's spines, the unkillable caterpillar would freeze, allowing the animals to track its scent and drag the spirit insect out from the deep fissures of the bedroom walls. If captured, alchemists would drop a powder of thunder pills and white alum onto its back, instantly dissolving its metaphysical tissue into a boiling, bloody red fluid. The crisis reached the highest halls of Imperial governance, generating a legal paranoia that remained completely unchanged across 3 distinct eras, from the Mongol Yuan dynasty to the Ming and finally the Qin. The Imperial Code of China treated the cultivation of the gu not as some simple superstition, but as a supreme, ultimate blueprint for murder by poisoning. The official handbooks distributed to the imperial judges and the mandarins warned that the weapon manifested in many forms, from the lethal venom of the golden caterpillar to the deeply taboo cultivation of baby goo, which weaponized the restless souls of the deceased young. The law of the empire was absolute. Statute 292 dictated that anyone caught merely keeping, breeding or hiding a goo poison in their home was immediately sentenced to public decapitation. Their assets were entirely forfeited to the state, and their innocent wives, children, and relatives living under their roof were permanently banished for life to the malaria-ridden borders 2,000 miles away, fully erasing the magical bloodline from the community forever. Within the ancient lands of the East, the supreme power of the black arts lay not in the physical venom of the jar, but in the devastating, unyielding paranoia of an empire locked in a perpetual war against the invisible shadows of the human mind. This ancient practice is still feared among some communities of southern China today. Whether the gu was a genuinely horrifying spectre that consumed its victims from the inside, or if it was simply a primitive misunderstanding of devastating parasitic diseases, the absolute fear and paranoia it produced caused real life-altering trauma for tens of thousands. So, the next time you glance up into the dark corner of your room and see an 8-legged horror scuttling down towards you, be thankful. At least it's crawling towards you and not out of you. This has been the Arcane Lantern. Until next time, keep your lights burning.